Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we will discuss a module from Reading New Literature in English, and the module is on New Writings in English from Southeast Asia. The content writer of this module is Omlan Baishya. He is a research scholar, NIT Silchar. First, let us introduce the module. The term Southeast Asia usually refers to the lands of Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Laos, Cambodia or Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. It must be mentioned here that people of Southeast Asian culture are also found in the eastern hills of India like Assam, notably Nagas, Garo, Khasi, Mizo, and Bangladesh, Kuki in Chittagong Hill areas, and the southern third of China, notably Thai Peaks and Miao. In ancient times, the Pacific and Madagascar were also colonized, and this resulted in a wider distribution of the Southeast Asian cultural and literary artifacts. However, it must also be remembered that many Southeast Asian departments in universities throughout the world include the literature from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka as part of their curriculum. This is aimed at getting a more comprehensive idea of the literatures of that particular geographical location. The literary and cultural relevance of this area is often undermined for its strategic sandwiched position between two major literary traditions, namely the Indian and the Chinese. However, this area has its own charming history and a range of literary artifacts which bear proof to its unique heritage and culture. Since this literary tradition encompasses various regional languages, it is very hard to draw a common trajectory for the literatures of all the constituent countries. However, what I shall endeavor in the next part is to point out certain major issues that have been incorporated in English literature of this area in post 1950s. Major issues like globalization. Most of the countries in this region have obtained freedom from colonial rulers either in early of mid 20th century. As a result, their economies have taken some time to recover from the hindrances they were left with. Mostly from the end of 20th century, they opened their market for global business. The economic liberalization did not only open up avenues for financial transaction but also for cultural and literary negotiations. The opening up of the dominant Western culture helped them explore different modes and topics of writing in Western countries and also in the eastern part of their territories. Such exposure helped them deal with global issues more comfortably. A name for itself, whom to go to. India or Bharat, Burma or Myanmar. A country is in the eternal flux when it cannot decide a name for itself. It is not simply a name. The larger question becomes whom they do side with. With the influx of Western economy, no longer are they countries being watched from a distance by the world at large. World superpowers are making their visits and opening up their gift boxes of democracy. Let us now, as a case study, consider the Burmese condition. Why has the Burmese government decided to negotiate with the West from the last decade of the 20th century? One reason is obviously because they are afraid of becoming a Chinese state. Mandalay and much of Upper Burma is owned by Chinese business. And crucially, China is set to open up a trade route from Yunnan province ending up in the Bay of Bengal. Realistically, the country has no option but to open trade with the West if it wants to survive, rather if it wants to survive on its own. Censorship. Most Southeast Asian countries lack a refined version of democracy to look up to and solve the eternal situation of crisis. Except the Indian subcontinent, all other countries have gone through an authoritative totalitarian regime, be it in the form of a right-wing fascist government or a socialist nationalist rule. Such regimes have historically depended much upon controlling all spheres of cultural manifestation, especially the literary field. The rule of emergency imposed on the Indian democracy in 1975 by the then Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi was such a period when the free movement of the press was restricted and many progressive writers were jailed and humiliated. Quite understandably, a whole gamut of literature against this fascist regime came up both during and after the period of crisis. Similarly, in the Burmese condition, in 1975, the then extreme socialist government printed a list of do's and don'ts to bar the use of any incorrect ideas and opinions or anything detrimental to the Burmese sociality program. The resulting mass censorship over successive generations was not merely a case of writers' freedom being jeopardized by the censor's pen. In fact, during General N.E. Win's government, he becoming increasingly paranoid, banned the use of the word sunset simply because his name roughly translated as sunrise. So he assumed that writers using sunset would be assassinating him in print. Ne Win's ruthless socialist agenda also forbade the color red because of its communist association, and later on until Aung San Suu Kyi was released from periods of imprisonment and house arrest. N.E. Win's successor, General Than Shiu, banned the use of the word mother. This time the reason was that mother was one of the many nicknames that Da Suu Kyi's followers conferred her with. The colonial memory. There hardly is any country in the entire world which can claim a more disturbance in the free movement of the literary field in the last century than Vietnam. The longer war against the mighty America from 1950s to 1970s was a period of complete cessation of the growth of literature. Vietnam's old generation of writers argues against the notion of the writer who does nothing but write. To older socialist Vietnamese, a writer may have a special vision, but they must also work for the good of the society that he or she lives in. One of the key observations of writers in Vietnam is just how much Vietnamese fiction writing can be viewed generationally from that of the older generation aligned to the state to the work of younger writers who refuse to view the war temporarily as the social and cultural watershed it was for their parents. This may be interpreted as a reaction against the tendency to showcase the collective traumatic history of a nation to overshadow the importance of contemporary concerns. A similar approach to literature could be found in the writings of some Bangladeshi writers who denied to acknowledge Mukti Yuddha, the war of freedom, as the single watershed event of the country in the latter half of the last century. They rather preferred to look at the larger socio-political issues that are plaguing the country in the present days. The text and writing practices of contemporary young Vietnamese authors like Hanoi's postmodernist Phan Nguyen Thu and Ho Chi Minh's city's hip-hop open-mouth writers mark a sharp contrast to those of earlier writers who grew up during the trauma of the Vietnam War, such as Tran Dan Kho and Bao Ninh, whose 1991 novel, The Sorrow of War, a novel, brings forth a narrator so defined by the war that he is unable to escape. The novel he writes. Tradition and modernity, or tradition versus modernity. With the end of the colonial rule, the writers of the colonized countries started looking back at their own indigenous literatures and histories that were hitherto unacknowledged. However, almost at the same time, the writers were exposed to Western influences through the inroad of a free market economy. The project of looking back halted for some time. There started a negotiation between the two modes of influences. Progressive left writers have almost unanimously accepted both the forms with open arms and advocated for an interplay between them. Whereas the right wing nationalist brand of writers are most bent on unidirectional agenda of looking back at the indigenous past with all admiration and vigor. Ismail Hussain comments, the present interest of the Malay people towards their own traditional literature has been very mixed. On the one side, there is the group of ardent nationalists who are eagerly grabbing anything that come in their way and trying to reconstruct it into a glorious cultural past at the expense of precision and historical accuracy. A member of this group will tell us of the rich literary heritage of the Malay people, but the probability is that he himself has not read four texts of this heritage and can hardly name 20 titles of that rich literature. On the other side, there is the group of young forward-looking people who are interested only in the present and future, who are anxiously trying to forget the past because the past has brought them nothing but embarrassment. Their literary past, of example, which was built upon the feudalist contrast of the unquestioned power of the court and the subservient position of the masses, can no longer give them any meaning in their struggle for human dignity. Search for an identity. In the first century, Southeast Asian literature in English has been one of the chief sites of examining and exploring contemporary issues regarding identity. As already mentioned, these countries were going through a critical phase of relocating their cultural and literary heredity. Questions regarding identity formation occupied one of the chief sectors of investigation. For example, with regard to ethnic identity construction, Malay literature not only offers insights into the writer's creation of Malay ethnic identity, but also the ways in which language, English in particular, shapes the writer's notion of what it means to be Malay. In terms of gender and sexual identities, Malay literature provides a site for the formation of normative and non-normative gender and sexual identities. Many Malaysian writers in English, particularly those from the later half of the last century, explore issues dealing with gender and sexuality from a religious perspective of Islam, which includes, among others, aspects of male female relationship, women's body, and alternative sexuality. Literary works produced by Malaysian women writers in English from 1960s to 1990s explore various issues, feminist perspectives of self and identity by reflecting on their personal gendered experiences as well as the struggles they live with daily in this world. They present their views about identity based on their specific experiences shaped by personal circumstances and everyday life, social expectations, and modernity along with that. In Malaysia, issues of self and identity, in addition to ethnicity and the nation, are vital preoccupations for many Malaysian writers in English as the consequence of the socio-political and cultural conditions that have affected their lives and works, their vocations, and freedom of speech, as well as their sense of identity and belonging to the country. This put the Malaysian writers in a perennial flux to decide how to portray their characters, and also themselves, their identities were in a confused state of belonging, primarily in terms of ethnicity or nationality, or embrace various identities in calling themselves an individual and a member of their ethnic and national community. Such tension, which permeates through and guides the works of many of these writers, is characterized by the tension between retaining their vocation as a writer and giving it up completely given the socio-political conditions affecting their lives and works. As a case study, we shall carefully discuss two major writers and their chief works in order to understand the different issues and techniques at play in New Southeast Asian writings. Our first author is Tehmina Durrani from Pakistan, and her autobiographical masterpiece, The Feudal Lord, 1994. Durrani is a Pakistani women's writer, rights activist, and author whose first book, The Feudal Lord, is about the traumatic and ghastly experiences she faced as a wife in a conservative Islamist family in Pakistan when she was married to Ghulam Mustafa Khan, the then Chief Minister of Pakistan. At a tender age of 17, Durrani was married to Anish Khan, with whom she had a daughter. However, they separated in 1976. Later, Durrani married Khan, who had married 4 times already. They had 4 children together. However, owing to tremendous mental and physical torture, Durrani and Khan ended their 13 years of institutional togetherness. This is precisely the time when Durrani started writing about her horrific experiences of being tortured by a feudal landlord, her husband. Law of the Jungle starts with Tehmina and Mustafa's immigration to London. Mustafa engages in a physical affair with Durrani's younger sister. Durrani remains silent and tries to please Khan with all her womanly attributes. However, the affair made her panicked and paranoid. She endures all her husband's physical assaults and sexual brutality as a part of her destiny. But then she decides to rebel the lion. I quote, "I am not your sister or your mother, I am your wife." This is how Tehmina problematizes and challenges the patriarchal notions of womanhood by denying all the ascribed roles of women as futile and abstract. But Mustafa can never allow her to leave him because he considers her as his carnal play toy, and moreover, such a decision of her essentially challenged the manliness of the most talked about figure in Pakistan. As a complement to Durrani, we shall study the poetry of Ocean Vuong and his book night sky with exit wounds. When thinking about night sky with exit wounds, our Copper Canyon Press published in 2016 by Ocean Vuong, one is captured by the beginning moments of the book beginning from within, wanting more than what was given or offered. Then that wanting peeking through a limited access watches a man being loved by nature. But in these few lines, one falls in love with the lyrical imagery Vuong paints us with. It is this act of labor we have come to love from Vuong. The way he scripts a scene reminds us of the endless opportunities language often hides from us. In the opening poem, Threshold, the speaker watches through the keyhole not the man showering, but the rain falling through him. It is a secret moment as holds his clutched breath behind the door, watching and waiting. Yet in this clandestine act, the speaker still coaxes his readers in with him to watch water like guitar strings snapping over his gloved shoulder. Once we turn the page, that we learn the cost of looking was to lose your way back with eyes wide open. The poem ends almost abruptly, the couplets giving way to a single line stanza. It is a fine introduction to a book where one loses oneself in looking at oneself while peeping through the lives of others. Simple and understandable, the poem is a fresh stroke of air before the dive into deeper waters, the beginning of a longer journey. For Vuong, it is world unreasonably punctuated by violence. Book ended on one side by colonialism in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and on the other hand, what we see today. In the second section, Vuong introduces us to the intersection of Vietnam and his family's history. As we journey from one poem to another, we realize how one's identity is constructed in the face of a preconditioned notion of social and cultural milieu. In the poem, Awed with Burning City, we see an overlapping of two otherwise contrasting experiences: the evacuation of American civilians and Vietnamese refugees during the fall of Saigon, all the while telling the story of a man trying to persuade a woman to have sex with him. This evolves as a fine documentary on how bodies react to each other when they wish to get closer, and at the same time, their primary concern remains to evade any upcoming danger. The poem becomes the true meaning of love and war. Vuong is showing us how he wishes to entrust the body to acts of love while destruction is literally tearing at the window. The city so white it is ready for ink, as if one urges another to revisit the history that one has written so far. Giving up the fear of destruction, of harm, for the immediate response to love is what entices a reader. And then the pressure to turn your back on this fear or an otherwise eraser of history. Don't worry, he says, as the first shell flashes their faces. My brothers have won the war, and tomorrow the lights go out. For Vuong, violence, its memory, its presence, and its possibility leaves a mark on the person and transforms him. The transformative power or the disfiguring power of violence is perhaps most apparent in the last poem of the first section, Self-Portrait as Exit Wounds. So far in this paper, we have discussed the general characteristics, if any, of the new literature in English from Southeast Asia, and also elaborated on the same by giving a detailed description of two eminent writers within this geotemporal boundary. Thank you.